our last presenter of the day, Esther. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Great. So today my talk is called The Selkie's Wife, A New Wave of Queer Folk Tales. Isn't that a photo of me? Once there was a Selkie. She doesn't usually get a name. Not when men tell the story, at any rate. There are many ways to tell a tale, and the way we've been telling this one is getting stale, so why don't we try again? Once there was a Selkie. Her name was Rona, and she had a wife. So starts my new solo folk show, The Selkie's Wife. In the past few months I've been working on Selkie's Wife. I found myself asking questions about subtextual and textual queerness in folklore. What makes a folktale such a perfect vehicle for perverse and subversive creativity? And why are these folkloric themes so resonant with LGBTQ+ people today? In this talk, I will discuss both my journey so far writing my own queer folktale and LGBTQ folktale content in general. I will begin with why traditional queer folktales are so hard to find and who erased them, before moving on to a brief study of modern rereadings and contemporary rewritings of this material. I will then go on to outlining the Selkie tale type itself, and why it was a story that was attractive to me both as a queer woman and as a theatre practitioner. Finally, and fittingly for a storytelling festival, I will perform a short story version of an extract from The Selkie's Wife to give you all an idea of my show and what queerly reinterpreting classic folklore looks like underneath my own hands. If I do this, yeah, it moves on, perfect. In Kay Turner's article, At Home in the Realm of Enchantment, The Queer Enticements of Grim Frau Holle, she says that, quote, "It seems no attention given at the library housing the past 300 years of the fairy tale's rise will open that history's door to pertinent contexts of queer lives engaging the fairy tale as tellers, listeners, readers, writers, or interpreters. Surely there are traces to touch, ghosts to be embraced, but the mist refuses to clear fully in the light of historical evidence," end quote. Or, as more succinctly put by YouTube creator Crossbarian on her video Queer Fairy Tales, looking for gay characters in fairy tales can feel like a fruitless endeavour. But why? As Alba Moroyan Diafaith, and Spanish speakers can correct me on that if you know how to say that name properly, points out in her PhD thesis, Fairy LGBT Tales, Mapping Queer Fairy Tale Retellings from the 1990s to 2010s, quote, "The strange world of the fairy tale is necessarily queer. It operates following the unknowable rules of wonder, where normalcy and all its agents are banished. While fairy tales are notoriously heterosexual, they are also indubitably campy. They are exaggerated and absurd in their mixing of mundane elements and magic, almost parodic in their depthless characterization as gendered archetypes," end quote. Diafaith is perhaps a little harsh in folk tales here, but you can see her point. Why is a genre so seemingly unbeholden to hegemonic norms of real life, so ensnared in the trappings of heteronormative, patriarchal societal norms? The answer, aside from Disney's meddling with our collective expectations of how these tales are meant to end and whose story they tell, is that many queer-coded folk tales were removed from archives and collections by 20th century folklorists horrified by their perverse nature. We have no way of knowing how many stories we have lost to time, forgotten by the oral tradition and deliberately wiped out from written documentation. Arguably the worst perpetrator of this selective type of folkloric preservation was an American academic called Stith Thompson, who excluded material he deemed obscene from the motif index of folk literature he worked on the 1920s and 1950s. the index designed to accompany the Aaron-Thompson-Uther Index. The ATU, a worldwide folklore catalogue with a system to log different tale types, is still in use today. I spent thrilling hours trying to understand how to use it during my Masters in Folklore and Ethnology in 2021. And yet, thanks to Thompson logging homosexuality and lesbianism as unnatural perversions alongside bestiality and incest all those years ago, not once in all those tales did I come across a story about people who were like me. There are still echoes of queerness to be found even in these patriarchy-approved tales, however, if you know how to look. Pete Geordie Wood, a writer and illustrator from Cornwall, came across the story The Dog and the Sea, not previously translated into English, and much to his delight realised that there was a clear, queer-coded element to this tale full of, in his words, sexual innuendos and dreamboat princes. In 2020, Wood released his own version of the story, seen here, called The Dog and the Sailor, and found much joy in taking that queer subtext and turning it into the crux of the story, the tale all the stronger for it. The homophobic authoritarianism found in Thompson's eradication of LGBTQ+ representation in folklore is sadly still easily found in discussions around folktales in the 21st century. In 2014, the Lithuanian Office of the Inspector of Journalist Ethics banned Amber Heart, a collection of fairy tales for children about minorities, because of two tales depicting same-sex love. In the words of Louis Seffert, quote, "For the Lithuanian authorities then, the magic of fairy tales and Amber Heart were all too threatening and real, because they had the power to reshape their readers' understanding of what constituted sexual relations, marriage, and family," end quote. It is this power that queer folktales hold, the ability to, quote, "offer new ways of seeing the world and relationship to it," end quote, which means that LGBTQ folk tales and fairy stories continue to be a subgenre full of powerful subversion, a proverbial 2 fingers up to heteronormative expectations of relationships, careers, gender roles, romance, and as pointed out by Seffert in his Marvels and Tales journal article, Queer Time in Charles Perrault's Sleeping Beauty, even the linear passage of time itself. Queer folktale material generally can be categorised into 3 sections, as summarised in the PhD thesis LGB Tales. Contemporary queer retellings, classical fairy tales, and fairy tale inflected original contemporary fiction. And you will have definitely read one of them, I reckon, because that's practically all of Neil Gaiman apart from anything else. This means that although academics such as Turner may struggle to be able to read queerness into pre-existing folktale texts, culled into respectability as they were, from the 1990s onwards, there has been a steady growth of newly written and reimagined LGBTQ folklore, which takes themes, motifs, or simply inspiration from the old tales and uses those concepts to convey something new, unapologetically queer, and often more culturally relevant to the society in which we find ourselves today. I thought I would talk about a few of these contemporary books as a sort of whistle-stop tour of the sapphic, gay, gender-bending, trans, asexual, or just plain old generally subversive new folktales available to us now in 2023. As explained by D.F. Faith, quote, "After 1995, things developed rapidly with regards to queer retellings. The new millennium brought an increasing number of retellings with a queer slant, and now by the 2010s, the number of queer retellings has become comparatively large," end quote. The start of this 1990s wave of new queer folklore content can perhaps be attributed to Emma Donoghue and her book Kissing the Witch, Old Tales in New Skins, a collection of feminist and queer stories which seem to kick-start a new era of LGBTQ storytelling that is only continuing to gain traction here in the 2020s. Another slightly older collection of queer fairy tales is Kirsty Logan's Rental Heart and Other Fairy Tales, published in 2014. I myself have a personal connection to this book, because I read it in 2017 and have been haunted by it ever since. The mix of horror, humour, subversion and sex found in its pages proven to be equally disturbing and addictive. The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night, an enchanted collection of modern fairy tales, is another equally darkly empowered selection of tales from author Jen Campbell in 2017. With collections like this clearly leading the way for horror-inspired folklore anthologies, such as 2020's Grimoire, New Scottish Folktales by Robin Robertson, full of nasty endings and murderous women. Other recent queer short stories collections include Elizabeth Hopkinson's Asexual Fairy Tales, published in 2019, Carrie Fransman's Gender Swapped Fairy Tales, published in 2020, Rachel Plummer's Wayne LGBT Reimaginings of Scottish Folklore, published in 2019, and Kevin Walker's Queer Folktales, a book of LGBTQ stories, published in 2020. Alongside shorter stories published in this format, tales in the aforementioned very popular subgenre categorised as fairy tale inflected original contemporary fiction can be found all over current Waterston's bookshelves. Notable examples include Lucy Hollins's 2021 reinterpretation of the Twa Sisters tale, named Sister Song, and Neil Gaiman's The Sleeper and the Spindle, in which Sleeping Beauty gets a decidedly sapphic waking kiss. I decided that one deserved a full spread there. And with Sasha Coward's non-fiction historical anthology Queer as Folklore successfully crowdfunded to be published sometime in the next year, the demand for new queered folk and fairy story content does not seem to be slowing anytime soon. And by the way, I do have a printed out list of resources that I've used for this talk, so if you're interested in knowing more about those, just ask me for a bit of paper with all of that in. I do have those printed out, so I'm seeing a couple of people trying to write quickly. Don't worry, just ask me for it afterwards. With such a rich tapestry of newly queered folklore from which to choose, why did I decide to reinvent the tale of the Selkie, trapped on land with a man she never chose? In the next section of my talk, I'm going to move on to discussing the Selkie tale type and why it felt like the right time to give a fresh reinvention for the stage rather than on the page. One of the best known folktale creatures to come out of Scottish folklore, the Selkie is a mysterious figure, a creature who is a seal when in the waves and a human when on land. This is possible thanks to their Selkie skin, which is removed on land to reveal a human form. Although I grew up with stories about Selkies, I realised when researching my show that I'd only really heard variations on the same tale over and over. The story that I used for inspiration for the show, in fact, and that I had no idea from where this story came. Folklorists these days tend not to be too focused on the quest for what we call the ur-text, the concept that somewhere there's the very first version of a song or a tale, the purest version, before oral folklore did what oral folklore always does, and the folklore artifact slowly evolves, sprouts variations, lengthens, shortens, and becomes 100 different things. It's often a fruitless hunt to try and find the ur-text, and one that misses the point entirely, since it is this evolution process that arguably makes these songs and stories into the folkloric items that we know and love today. Sometimes, however, a hunt through the back catalogue of a story or song's history can be useful. And as I wanted to know where seafaring half-humans came from, I decided to give it a try. There was less academic research available on the subject than I expected, but one argument I came across was, to me at least, quite convincing. Selkie stories are thought to originate from North Uist, Heisker and Orkney. Orkney Jar, a multi-award-winning heritage website dedicated to the heritage of the Orkney Islands, has an entire section dedicated to the origin of Selkie stories. Thought perhaps to be fairies, fallen angels, cursed humans, or drowned sailors, written reports from the 18th and 19th centuries made clear that locals very much believed the Selkies, alongside the more malevolent, shape-shifting Finfolk, to be real. One possible suggestion for the origin of both of these tales is the proven appearance of the Finnar people of northern Scandinavia, now known as the Sami, in the Orkney Isles from the 17th century onwards. It was recorded that the Sami used small kayak-style boats for fishing, covered in sealskin, which would then be removed and laid out to dry once the fishing trip was over. It is not an unreasonable argument, therefore, that when combined with the well-known belief in Scandinavia and beyond that the Finnar people held magical powers, that the Orcadians saw mysterious, unusual strangers who were rumoured to be mages, saw the removed sealskins lying out to dry, and came to a supernatural conclusion. If this theory is indeed correct, then that would place Selkie stories originating sometime in the 1600s. And it's a tale type which has only grown in popularity over the centuries and continues to be an inspiration for a myriad of artists, including Emily Portman, Lucy Farrell, and Julie Files. Alongside the most popular story, where a beautiful Selkie is captured by a fisherman and lives with him raising their children before either she or her children find the hidden seal coat and she and her children escape back to the sea, there is a number of other lesser-known stories. In The Selkie and the Hunter, a seal hunter accidentally gravely injures the king of the Selkies and only escapes with his life due to the mercy of the kindly creatures, having paid his debt by being able to save the life of the king he nearly unwittingly murdered. In The Selkie of Sulskerry, the ending is much less happy for the Selkies. The Selkie, male in this tale unusually, unwittingly killed along with his son by the new beau of his human lover. But it was the gaps in the most well-known story, the Selkie wife, which really intrigued me. We know about the Selkie being trapped on land, at least for a few years if she gives birth to multiple children. But what had she left behind, beneath the waves? Surely she hadn't just been swimming around on her own, no family or partner. The more I thought about it, the more I wanted to write about this other life, the one we never get to know about. The story fixated on the fisherman and how his wife was never going to be truly his. With just an apostrophe and one letter, I realised I could change the focus of the story entirely. And what would it mean to make that shift from the Selkie wife to the Selkie's wife? In the beginning of 2022, I wrote a short story from the perspective of the Selkie's wife left behind in the waves, and it proved to be a concept which captured my imagination. Meant as a sort of vignette, a description of her side of the tale, rather than anything that changed the plot of the actual folklore, this new wife character just wouldn't leave me alone. She had a different ending to the tale, and she wanted me to tell it. Fast forward to now, in May 2023, and that short story has turned into the beginnings of a play. I have performed a 15-minute version of it at Capitol Theatre's Open Floor New Writing Night in Edinburgh. I've been awarded a bursary by Aberdeen Arts Centre to develop the play further at the Arts Centre in January. It's also probable that I'm going to be performing a script-in-hand 30-minute version of it at a London venue, The Glitch, in July, which is exciting. And I'm hoping to perform a 45-minute finished version of it at Edinburgh Fringe 2024. One idle idea is turning out to be taking me on quite the adventure. Kevin Walker, professional storyteller and author of Queer Folk Tales, a book of LGBTQ+ stories, mentions in his introduction to that book that, quote, "As a professional storyteller, I had noticed that there were few queer storytellers who actually told queer stories," end quote. As I've discussed today in this talk, this is a statement which I believe is thankfully becoming less true. Queer representation in folklore continuing to grow and evolve. I am proud to be a queer professional teller of stories, and as I finish my talk today with this short performance of an extract from my own queer tale, I encourage you all to take another look at the stories in which you grew up with. In the words of Andrea Meertholin, Queer people have always been excellent at taking tales and, quote, seeking to spin their own narratives within them, end quote. Which tale will you spin? So,